And over to California's 42nd congressional district, you will find Liam O'Mara, who is also running against a Republican incumbent. It's a district in the southern part of the state that includes part of the western section of Riverside County. And it also has, like the district that we just talked about in Texas, it has a 9-point Republican edge. But an establishment centrist Democrat running in 2018 was beaten by 13 points. So maybe against conventional wisdom, against the elite conventional wisdom, it's not that smart a choice to run centrist Democrats in Republican territory. O'Mara is also a working class kid. His great grandfather helped found the International Longshore Warehouse Workers Union, one of the great progressive unions, and his father is, in fact, retiring after 50 years on the waterfront. His mom is an SEIU member. Liam went back to school relatively later in life, finished a PhD in history, and has been teaching college for the last 10 years. As you will hear, I kind of disagree with him on one plank of his support for balanced budgets, which I totally disagree with, but he generally does have progressive positions. Liam, you have an interesting history, at least for me personally. I had the good fortune of working for the Australian Maritime Union for a couple of years. And I noted that your great grandfather helped found the ILWU, the Longshore Union here on the West Coast. In fact, as you well know, it was really founded, the main founder was Harry Bridges, an Australian himself. So, how did your great grandfather get involved in that? And just tell us a minute or two about that background. That's pretty interesting.
Well, the family moved out here. He had come in from New York and resettled on the West Coast. Uh, the time he was growing up, they still ran into some kind of pervasive anti-Irish discrimination, so the family had changed their names and moved off to the West Coast. I had actually had to. It's a long story there, but I when I was younger reclaimed the family name O'Mara. He was under Maher, Maher, and got involved working out here. That was the new profession he settled into, and then got involved immediately in the union. He actually was in the first generation that managed to retire on pension through that union. My grandfather also was in it, and then as well as in the merchant marine for a while, but he died fairly young from a brain aneurysm, I believe. My father was in the union for 50 years. He actually just retired.
Hmm. And where did they work out of? What docks did they work out of?
The Los Angeles and Long Beach, the joint port here, the largest port on the West Coast.
Yes, they were very, very powerful ports, and the union has been a very, very activist and very progressive union, as you well know, on the left coast, as I like to say. But they've been out there on the front lines on strikes and being very active and being very militant for a very long time. So I assume that that kind of obviously informs your own cultural perspective about unions and about working class issues and about the need to struggle and essentially looking at this as workers versus employers and the need for very strong unions, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the employers are never going to just give you something. You have to demand it. It's the only way we've actually ever gotten any of the things that we have. Uh, I've always been happy with the history of militants there in ILWU, and have been sad to watch over the course of my life things gradually weaken because of the rising automation and the difficulty of constantly renegotiating the contracts. And yeah, as the laws have changed at the federal level, it has made it more difficult for the unions to operate.
Yes, and many of those shipping companies have become global giants, so it's much harder to wrestle them to the bargaining table when you're dealing with these massive companies that are based in Dubai and all around the world. It's much harder for a union like the ILW to maintain the standards, but they've been pretty successful at least maintaining standards. Although, as you point out, there's been a lot of job loss relative and because of automation at the ports, and the automation continues. So when you think about now telescoping forward and jumping forward, what is it that you think you're trying to bring to this campaign and this race to the folks in the district, in the 42nd congressional district, which traditionally has been a little more conservative in terms of its politics? What do you bring in terms of the notion that unions are important for all the people in that district?
Well, it's simply a matter of a basic perspective of orientation. My loyalties are with the working class, with the working men and women of the 42nd District. Whether you identify as working class or as middle class, as long as you're working for a paycheck, you are technically working class. And a lot of the people in the Inland Empire do not even make a living wage. It's actually less than half if you count the entire IE. And the 42nd is a little better than some parts, but still, there's a significant amount of poverty out here. And there's not a lot of really good, sustainable job development. One of the things that's bothered me about the kind of jobs that keep getting attracted out here is it reminds me of the struggles we had on the port. You end up with these large warehousing and logistics businesses. They can initially hire some workers, but they're all aggressively automating. And all of these, logistics places, they're eventually all going to be run by robots. So where are the actual jobs for the people who are out here?
Well, it certainly is true that automation has an effect in employment, but I think the fundamental problem is that even when you're replacing jobs, and there are always new jobs being created, the problem is that when automation replaces jobs, you're getting jobs that just simply don't pay a living wage. That's the fundamental problem. It's a problem of power and leverage at the bargaining table, and because of capitalism.
Exactly, and the difficulty of even organizing workers at a lot of these places. One of the things that we saw on the port was in successive contract negotiations, new jobs being created, they tried to push them through as non-union positions. Some of those technical positions or computer positions weren't actually part of the union. And if you keep pushing more in that direction, it gradually erodes the strength of the union itself. And the simple fact is that, I mean, while we're always going to be creating new jobs, 47% of American jobs are at risk from automation in the coming decades, which means we need to be paying attention to ways to retrain the workforce for areas where they're still competitive, get them the right kind of education and tools and whatnot, and certainly improve the strength of labor unions as a whole so that they can advocate for worker rights.
So you are very much a progressive on many issues. There's one area, and this won't surprise you because you yourself point out that you probably are different from most progressives in this area. There's one area where I strongly disagree with you, and that is around the issue of balanced budgets. You say on your website, one area of common ground that I share with many conservatives is a desire for balanced budgets. Now, you get part of it right, which is that conservatives, frankly, Democrats and Republicans, waste a ton of money, largely because of the military industrial complex and going into needless, endless wars. As you well know, there was broad bipartisan support for the Iraq War, which really cost, if you look at what Joe Stiglitz said, the Nobel Prize winner, roughly $3 to $4 trillion and counting. And it's not just about cash, it's about the opportunities lost, the money that we pay for veterans coming back who need care, and all sorts of things like that. But the reality is that there's no problem in running deficits. You can run deficits for a very, very long time. It's about what you spend it on. But you are in favor of balanced budgets, which, by the way, as we're recording this, so is Pete Buttigieg. He's been running around saying that the party, the Democratic Party, has forgotten the notion of balanced budgets. Now, of course, the Republican Party is completely hypocritical about that. But I would argue that there is no need to have a balanced budget. And in fact, when you argue for a balanced budget, you're hurting regular people. Now, tell me why your position is and why you see it differently.
Okay, so the way I'd point to this, first off, the on the matter of like indefinite deficits and things like modern monetary theory, that kind of thing. Yes, there is no actual need for it. From my perspective, it's a matter of trying to show a little bit of common ground with the sense that the government doesn't need to be wasting taxpayer money. I would actually argue that it's a very progressive position in that I would talk about massive cuts to our wasteful military, the constant wars. There's absolutely no reason to be spending the money that we do. It's not defense. We don't have a Department of Defense. We have two giant oceans and two friendly neighbors. There's no reason to be spending $700 billion a year on this.
And you will get no disagreement from me at all about that. I mean, the fact is there was no peace dividend, that the military is bloated. We spend way too much on that. But but you favor Medicare for all. I know that you are very supportive of dealing with climate change. All of those are going to cost tremendous amounts of money, and those are really smart investments to make. Not to mention
They are.
rebuilding the U.S. infrastructure. If you look, for example, at the Eisenhower years, when Eisenhower actually created the interstate system, the interstate road system, that was essentially financed by large amounts of debt. So my only point is, I think from a progressive point of view, I don't agree with you that it doesn't seem like a progressive point of view to argue generally for balanced budgets.
The In terms of deficits, when you're talking about investments, things like the Green New Deal, or looking back to Eisenhower's highway things, those to me are a separate issue, because if you're laying out a program that's going to see a massive return, then it actually isn't really contributing to debt. My issue is the debt. The national debt did not really go up under Eisenhower. The national debt was basically flat until the Reagan era. Whenever you overspend like this, it ends. So infrastructure investments, for example, always pay back 3 to 1. So it's a simple investment that's going to pay itself for itself.
That's
And
fine.
things
There,
like things like Medicare, in terms of what other areas. I mean, my key issue there is it's understanding the way the tax policy works. If we actually use a progressive tax system like every other developed country in the world, and we start looking at the kind of like transactional taxes that people use on, like the business stuff, so you can actually hit people like Amazon, there's more than enough money being produced in the richest country in the world to pay for all of this stuff.
you'll get no argument from me that we need to tax the rich more, that we need a more progressive tax system, that corporations like Amazon, it's an outrage that they're paying zero taxes. My only point is, and I would say I'll add to that actually, and that investments bring back things. Of course, that's true. But there is nothing economically wrong from a progressive point of view to run deficits year after year and have a national debt. What you are correct about, I would argue, from a progressive point of view, is it depends about where you spend the money. That's totally right. If we're wasting it on foreign wars, that's completely outrageous. That makes no sense to have a national debt. But you could carry a national debt and deficits far into the future if you're spending it on climate change issues, on infrastructure, on healthcare. Those are things that, in fact, do bring benefits back to society. But there's no problem in running deficits. But I get where you're coming from. Let me just move on to a topic.
Can I give you
Go ahead.
very briefly? The key issue for me is about framing. One of the things that I constantly run into in a conservative area regarding progressive policies is people assuming that it's going to create more debt, that it's going to hit them, that they have to pay in taxes. So if you talk about the Medicare thing there, it's like, my taxes are going to go up. Student loan debt, my taxes are going to, they're not. I'm trying to show people that it's not actually going to hurt them at all. So it's a framing issue for me. I don't have any disagreement on the mathematics or the issues in terms of like the deficit.
Okay, so the last question I want to ask you, the last area, is about the district itself. One of the things that's interesting, there's sort of contradictory information that would lead you to think that, on the one hand, if you looked at certain information, that, wow, this is a tough hill to climb. On the other hand, maybe not so. On the one hand, the district is rated +9 Republican, but then I also noticed that a third of the population is Hispanic, and I assume that a lot of the Hispanic voters may either not have voted, obviously, in the last election, like lots of people who don't vote, and that there's a real issue about turning Hispanic voters out. That's traditionally been a problem for the Democratic Party. There's always been this a mythical idea that if the Hispanic community just turned out, if they registered and they voted, they turned out in huge numbers, Democrats would win all across the country. Now, Julia Peacock, who had run, as you well know, in the last election and did pretty well, I think she lost only by about 5 percentage points. She decided not to run, partly because the big donors and the big poobahs in Washington don't think she has a chance. So they don't want to invest in a district that Trump won by 12 percentage points. So what's your vision of how you win this district and defeat the incumbent?
So the Hispanic vote is part of that, obviously, trying to mobilize more of that. The simple fact is there are a lot of people out here who are not registered voters. And the single largest growing chunk of the voting pool has been no party preference. So they're people that don't necessarily have an immediate tribal loyalty, even if they have a certain lean one way or the other. My argument for it actually is to focus on the fact that Trump did win by 12 points, because a lot of the people who vote for Trump, you're never going to get. There's a certain chunk of the population that is way out of reach for Democrats, but there are a lot of people who voted for him because he talked about the working class. He ran as a right populist. He was doing it dishonestly, but he ran as a populist. So my argument is the solution to a right populist is a left populist, someone who's also going to talk about kitchen table issues, basic working class issues. How can I make you richer? How can I improve your life? So my outreach to people out here, and one of the reasons that I've had a number of conservative NPPs and even Republicans and Trump voters say, yeah, I would back you, is that I'm willing to talk about the things that matter to them economically. And they want to feel heard.